Universities were happy to lie through their teeth as long as they could encourage students to come onto campus.
It's not right that the UK students should almost get preferential treatment and they're acting almost entitled.
Hello and welcome to Student Problems Debates. I'm your host, Sam. This week's topic is, should UK students get a partial refund for the education they've received during the coronavirus pandemic? We have two students who will be debating the argument from both sides. We have Ben, a politics and sociology student from the University of Manchester, and Matt, a law student also from Manchester. Let's get into it. Debaters, you will now have 30 seconds to tell us your opening arguments, starting with Matthew, please.
There's an option, just like every year, to defer your studies, and so they should not really receive any special treatment for choosing to go to university at that allotted time. Tuition fees really are seldom repaid. If you were £2,250 a month, you would just pay £4 per month a year. So then for a year, you're at £48 per month. And so you'll never repay it. So really, just take the education as you get it, and you'll be in a better job for it with your degree.
Thank you very much, Matt. And Ben, could you give us your opening statement, please?
The biggest problem we have with higher education in this country is, first of all, it's just run for profit. In any system where it's run for profit rather than for the students, it's never going to be a conducive environment for those students. Any idea that universities care about your well-being is probably a complete facade. And this year particularly, students have been especially failed. My university today released a statement saying literally that they've exceeded their financial targets because of the amount of students they managed to get onto campus this year, and they did that knowing it was unsafe and inadequate for students.
We'll ease ourselves in on something you might agree on, I don't know. The first question on this list, have students received an acceptable level of education during the pandemic?
The truth is, nobody can justify paying £9,000 for essentially being ferried across the country into a different city and sitting in a hall and going to a couple of Zoom lectures every week. You know, £9,000 I think is extortion in any circumstances, and we have to talk about why there's such a marketisation of our education system in a way that there isn't in any other country in Europe. And so I don't think anybody should be paying £9,000 any year, but this year in particular, there's no justification for why this year of education should cost you the same amount as it would when you're getting the full experience. The university isn't spending the same amount on you, so there's no reason you should be giving them the same amount of money.
Acceptable is unfortunately a rather grey area, and this may well be adequate to somebody who is independent in their learning style. They may be able to just do these 2 Zoom lectures a week or whatever, and then go off to the library, or the online library in this case, and do their studies, whereas others may need some more assistance than 2 lectures a week. But university's independent study after all.
I suppose that leads us nicely to the next question, which is, were university students sent back to halls prematurely?
With COVID, it's been unprecedented, and so there has to be really some form of trial and error to learn what's best. But equally, we also need some element of normality in our lives. We need to almost have this year as a learning experience for what not to do, and I appreciate that that's a tough one to hear for people like Ben who are in this situation. However, is it worth the risk of just affecting this year, learning from it to prevent any additional effects to subsequent years?
The trade unions, the UCU, who represent all the academic staff, said back in May, that, we don't think this is a great idea to bring all students back to campus. Again, I don't want to always bring it back to my university, but in Fallowfield, where I am, we've ferried about 4,000 students back into cramped halls. And no surprise, within second week, Fallowfield was number 1 COVID hotspot in the entire country. Once we'd all been crammed into those halls, they then weren't able to deal with the fact that they had thousands and hundreds of students in isolation. They started telling students to go out to supermarkets and do their own shopping if they tested positive for coronavirus. So we're not just talking about putting students at risk, we're talking about putting entire communities at risk, and then putting all that blame back onto students, which I think was the worst bit, was the government and the universities working together to ferry students like cattle up and down the country, and then put all the blame onto students when the inevitable happened.
Will you give us a bit of background, Ben, on the rent strike that's just happened? I know you guys at Manchester Unit occupied a building and you've been successful in receiving some compensation. Tell us a bit about that.
We managed to win a concession from the uni, which is a 30% rent reduction from September to January for half the year. So we're quite happy with that. I think it's, as that we know of, it's the biggest rent strike in the UK history in terms of money won. basically it works out between £600 to £1,000 per student they're getting back. So that's up to £1,000 back in the pocket of every student at the university and halls. And we're continuing the rent strike in January because, there's a lot of issues that are still going on at the uni, and they're still not getting us back the rent for the weeks that are way away.
You've got a 30% reduction there that you just said from September to January. And so proverbially you've got £1,000 in your pocket. Do you not think that it's really the case that you've had some form of rent reduction, whether you should be entitled to it or not, and that you're pushing your luck by continuing it past January?
I mean, not at all, to be honest. I think, the rent reductions that we've got are the bare minimum in terms of the rent reduction we've got just puts it in line with what the cost of accommodation is outside of these halls. These universities are ripping off and exploiting students day after day after day. There's no reason every student in the country should have a rent cut, because that's the thing. It's not just about Manchester. We've won our rent cut. And I think it's quite unfair that we're one of the only universities that's won a rent cut so far. I think Bristol and Glasgow have as well. But every student in the country deserves that rent cut.
This 30% reduction, if it was rolled out across the university, what the knock-on effects are to the services that the university can offer when normality resumes, if and when it does. Taking it more to a political stance, which I'm sure you'll appreciate, Ben, when we do leave the European Union in January, the University of Manchester gets a lot of grants for its science programmes. And so when they lose access to that EU funding, they're going to have to claw it back from somewhere. And then equally, if they've already given concessions to students, there's going to be a massive shortfall in their budget because they've got big campuses to pay for as well.
I'm not going to lose sleep over a university that brings in about £1 billion a year. I think they can afford that cut. They clearly have that money. These universities, they're not facing bankruptcy. They're morally bankrupt, but I don't think they're anywhere near that sort of financial situation. And the government does have a role to play in supporting those universities if they get anywhere near that. But these universities, I think it's just about levelling the playing field more than anything.
Now, Ben, I know this is a question quite close to your heart, considering all the protests that have been going on at Manchester Uni at the moment. The question is, if students are unhappy with their level of education, how should they best go about voicing their opinion?
Firstly, any student reps or student bodies that University of Manchester has, or indeed any university in the country, I think they need to go through them first, primarily, and they can then go up to the higher echelons of the management of the university. But my advice, be it because I'm a law student or whatever, I would go with solutions, not just problems. Anybody can protest, anybody can say, I'm not happy about this, but then what do you want to do about it?
I think you shouldn't be afraid to take a bit more radical and direct action. I think one of the things we learned here is that universities more than willing to ignore you if you're just, signing petitions or, that sort of stuff. They don't really care about you. And I think we've proven that you can win. A lot of people are very pessimistic about protests and a lot of pessimistic about what it can do. But I think we've proven that it is really possible for students to put pressure on their universities and win, real financial gains from them. Don't be afraid to take direct action. Don't be afraid to organise a rent strike. I think anyone who's in any uni and feels, is looking at Manchester, looking at Bristol, looking at Glasgow and seeing what's happened there, I think you have just as much as right to that rent cut. This is a really important moment for students right now. If you're a first year, you've had that A-levels fiasco in the summer. Now you've had this, and I think it should be a real awakening moment about the fact that students don't have to just sit there and take everything that's thrown at them, and they can fight back, and it is possible to win against these massive universities.
Going back to our original question, which was, should UK students receive a full or partial refund for the education they've received during the coronavirus pandemic? Could we now have closing thoughts from you both, please?
Whilst people have got differing views on the UK students, I think that they're still not factoring in the international students. And so in order for it to be a level playing field, these people are having rent strikes and rent cuts and whatever, but these people are paying it out of their own pocket. And it's not right that the UK students should almost get preferential treatment, and they're acting almost entitled because they have student finance, which most of them won't pay back anyway. It's written off after 30 years, and it's almost seen as a write-off by the government because a graduate or a degree is generally leading to a better paid job, which means more paid in tax.
We're more than happy to stand with international students. We do a lot of work with international students and making sure, including, a lot of international students who do live in halls will be getting that money back. They will be getting that £1,000 back. But I think it's also important, this attitude of if we don't all win at the same time, then it's not a win. I think it's more than okay to be we can get one win now and the other wins come later. We shouldn't be, giving up completely if we don't get a win for everyone at exactly the same time. That's not how fights are won. I just don't see how it's like feasibly justifiable to be charging the same amount year on year when it's evident, like painfully evident to everyone, that the experience just isn't the same, service provided just isn't the same. But I think it's also really important to get at this framing of, is it worth it? Because I don't think any education is worth £9,000, because I don't think any university should be charging £9,000. So I wouldn't say any year is worth £9,000, but this university, this year especially, isn't worth it.
Okay, that's all we've got time for. Sadly, our Zoom session is running out. Thank you so much to both of our debaters. A really interesting discussion today, which a lot of people are really passionate about right now, I'm sure. Thank you for watching at home and for getting involved. I've been Sam, and I'll see you next time.